The sparks came over the fence first. Jonah Crew noticed them on his first evening in the house. Small, bright orange gold against the darkening sky, rising from the yard next door in clusters that lasted half a second each before winking out. They appeared in rhythmic bursts, synchronized to a sound he could feel before he could hear it. The deep, percussive ring of metal being struck by something heavy at regular intervals. He was standing in his kitchen, his new kitchen, in his new house in a border town he had moved to 3 days ago for reasons he was still assembling into a narrative that made sense, holding a cup of tea he had forgotten to drink and watching sparks rise over a fence he had not yet looked over. The fence was 4 feet tall, wooden, old, the particular weathered quality of timber that had been standing long enough to have opinions about the arrangement. It separated his yard from the yard next door, which was all he knew about the yard next door, because Jonah Crew was the kind of man who learned about new environments through observation rather than introduction, and he had not yet observed enough to form an introduction. He observed the sparks instead. They were beautiful. This was not a word Jonah used casually. He was a clerk, a man whose professional relationship with language had made him precise about vocabulary and reluctant to deploy words that exceeded their appropriate scope. But the sparks were beautiful. They rose in arcs, parabolic, each one tracing a curve that was mathematically predictable and aesthetically perfect. The particular, transient artistry that physics produced when metal was struck at high temperature, and the fragments of the striking were launched into air that was cool enough to make them glow. He watched them for 20 minutes. The tea went cold. The kitchen darkened around him, and the sparks kept coming, burst after burst, synchronized to the ringing that came through the fence, like a heartbeat transmitted through wood. He did not look over the fence, not that first night. The sparks were enough. He looked over the fence on the second night, not deliberately, involuntarily, the way a person's eyes follow a sound to its source, when the sound has been occupying their attention long enough to generate curiosity that exceeds the politeness that prevents them from staring. She was orc. This was the first thing he registered, and it registered with the particular complicated neutrality of a man who had grown up in the capital, where orcs were present but peripheral, visible in the markets, in the labor districts, in the specific, designated zones that the post-war arrangement had established for interspecies coexistence. He had opinions about orcs in the way that most capital residents had opinions, uninformed, untested, shaped by proximity without interaction, the particular hollow familiarity that comes from seeing a species without knowing it. She was at a forge, an outdoor forge, an anvil set on a stump, a fire pit with bellows, the particular open-air arrangement that blacksmiths used when the weather permitted and the work required ventilation. The setup was positioned in the center of her yard, 10 feet from the fence, close enough that the heat reached Jonah's face when the wind shifted. She was working. The word did not do justice to what she was doing. It was like calling a storm weather or calling a river water. She was striking metal. A piece of glowing iron was on the anvil, and she was hitting it with a hammer that was too heavy for any human Jonah had ever seen to lift with one hand, and she was lifting it with one hand. And the lifting was not effort. It was rhythm. Her arms were green, the deep, vivid green of northern orc lineage. The muscles in her forearms shifted with each strike, the particular, visible mechanics of a body doing what it was built to do. Her dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, and the forge light caught the angles of her face. Strong jaw, high cheekbones, the particular angular beauty that orc women carried when their features were illuminated by fire rather than daylight. She was not beautiful the way capital women were beautiful. She was beautiful the way the sparks were beautiful. Kinetic, temporary, produced by force, existing in the specific momentary space between creation and disappearance. Jonah watched. He watched the hammer rise. He watched it fall. He watched the iron change shape under the impact, bending, flattening, becoming something that it had not been moments ago and would not be again, because metalwork moved in one direction and the direction was toward form. He watched the sparks. They were better from this angle, closer, larger, the individual trajectories visible instead of the collective arc. Each spark was a fragment of the striking, a piece of iron too small to remain attached, launched by the impact into a brief, luminous existence that ended in darkness. He watched for 40 minutes. He did not move. He did not speak. He stood at the fence with his cold tea and watched a woman he had never met do something he had never seen, and felt something he had not felt in 10 years of sitting at a desk in the Capitol, pushing a pen across paper in the specific, repetitive, numbing rhythm of a man who recorded other people's transactions without ever making one of his own. He felt alive. The sparks did that, or the watching did, or the particular unexpected discovery that the world contained things he had not known about, and that some of those things were 10 feet away on the other side of a 4-foot fence, in the yard of an orc woman who hit metal with a hammer and produced small pieces of temporary light. She caught him on the 5th night. He had been standing at the fence at approximately the same time each evening, 7:30, when the light was low enough that the sparks were visible and the air was cool enough that the forge heat was pleasant rather than aggressive. He had developed a routine around the watching, tea, kitchen, fence, sparks, 40 minutes, bed. The routine was the most interesting part of his day, which said something about the rest of his day that he preferred not to examine. On the 5th night, the hammering stopped mid-strike. The silence was sudden. The particular, jarring absence of a sound that has been continuous. The acoustic equivalent of a missing stare. Jonah looked up from the sparks, from the point in the air where the sparks had been and were no longer, and found the orc woman looking directly at him. She was holding the hammer at her side. Her amber eyes were on his face, with the particular direct, unblinking attention that orc women brought to everything, and that human men frequently misidentified as aggression. 5 nights, she said. Her voice carried the forge, the heat, the metal, the particular resonance of a woman who spent her evenings producing sound and whose vocal cords had adapted to compete with it. Deep, clear, with the subsonic undertone that orc voices produced and that human ears heard not as sound but as vibration. Every evening, she continued, same time, same spot, same cold tea. She had noticed the tea. She had noticed the cold tea, which meant she had been observing him, observing her for long enough to track the temperature decline of a beverage through a fence from 10 feet away in firelight. "I'm sorry," Jonah said. "I didn't mean to. You're staring. I know. I'm sorry." Why? The question was not, "Why are you sorry?" The question was, "Why are you staring?" Direct, the specific, unpadded directness that orc communication favored, and that human communication considered rude, and that was, Jonah thought, considerably more efficient than the alternative. He thought about lying. He thought about the polite, deflective options. "I was looking at the stars. I was checking the weather. I was admiring your fence." The particular, socially acceptable untruths that humans deployed when caught doing something they were not supposed to be doing. He told the truth instead. "The sparks are beautiful," he said. She looked at him, the particular evaluative look of a person who has received an answer they did not expect and is recalibrating their assessment of the person who gave it. "The sparks," she repeated. "When you hit the metal, the fragments that come off, they rise in arcs parabolic. Each one is different, but the pattern is consistent, and the color changes depending on the temperature of the iron, brighter when it's hotter, darker as it cools. The cooler ones last longer because they have more mass. The brighter ones are more beautiful because they're more intense." Pro has suffered from an intense cache with broken fury of crudeness and become in an unliving devant. Here is what they want. But for how I see as they open the arrow, and the arrow, that is my dear. He stopped. He had been speaking in the particular detailed analytical register that his clerk's brain produced when it was processing sensory information and converting it into language. It was not how people talked about sparks. It was how people talked about data. "I'm a clerk," he said, as though this explained everything. It didn't, but it was the best context he could offer for the fact that he had just described his neighbor's forge waste with the precision of a man cataloging inventory. The orc woman looked at him for a long moment. Then her mouth did something he had not seen it do in 5 nights of observation. It moved, not a smile. The geological predecessor of one, the tectonic shift that indicated something was happening beneath the surface that had not yet reached the surface. "Nobody has ever called my sparks beautiful," she said. "Sparks are waste heat. They're what happens when the strike is imprecise. A perfect strike produces no sparks. Then I'm glad your strikes aren't perfect." The tectonic shift accelerated, closer to the surface. Still not a smile, but the bedrock was moving. "My name is Bryn," she said, "and if you're going to stand at my fence every evening watching me work, you might as well come over and learn what you're watching." She turned back to the anvil. She picked up the hammer. She struck the iron. Sparks rose. Beautiful, parabolic, the particular transient artistry of imprecise contact between tool and material. But this time, she did not look at the iron. She looked at the fence, at the spot where Jonah was standing. "The gate is on the left side," she said. "It opens." Jonah opened the gate on the 6th evening. 3 steps, his yard, the gate, her yard. 12 feet of total distance, the longest 12 feet he had walked since leaving the capital. Her yard was different from his, different the way a workshop is different from a waiting room. His yard was grass and quiet, and the particular maintained absence of activity that characterized the space of a man who used his outdoor area for nothing except traversal between the front door and the street. Her yard was a workplace. The forge at the center, the anvil, the tool rack along the fence, his fence, the shared fence, now visible from the other side with a different set of tools hanging on it, the water trough for quenching, the woodpile, the coal store. It was organized the way a body is organized, every element positioned in relation to every other element. The distances calibrated for reach and efficiency, the specific, functional geography of a space that had been arranged by someone who understood the physics of their work and had optimized the environment accordingly. "Stand there," Bryn said, pointing to a spot 3 feet from the anvil. "Not closer. Sparks carry." He stood. The heat was immediate. The forge radiated at a temperature that his face registered as significant and his body registered as warning. But Bryn moved through the heat as though it were air, the particular acclimated ease of a person whose body had spent years in proximity to temperatures that would have driven a desk clerk to the nearest shade. She held out the hammer. "Take it," she said. Jonah took it. The hammer was heavier than he expected, significantly, immediately, the particular weight that exceeded his grip strength and that his arms were not calibrated to manage. He held it with both hands. It felt like holding a piece of the earth that someone had attached a handle to. Now hit the iron. The iron was on the anvil, glowing orange waiting. Jonah raised the hammer. The raising was an event, the specific, multi-muscle effort of a man whose body had spent 10 years performing the fine motor task of writing and was now being asked to perform the gross motor task of striking. And the difference between the two was not a matter of degree, but of kind. He brought the hammer down. The sound was wrong. Not the ringing, percussive note that Bryn's strikes produced, a flat, scraping contact that skidded across the iron surface rather than striking it squarely. No sparks, no shape change, just the particular, unsatisfying sound of a tool that had been used incorrectly by a person who did not know what correctly meant. "Again," Bryn said. She was watching with the particular patient assessment of a craftsman evaluating a beginner's first attempt and finding it precisely as bad as expected. He struck again. Slightly better. The contact was more square, the sound less scraping. A single spark detached from the iron and rose approximately 6 inches before extinguishing. Again, he struck, and again and again. Each strike was marginally better than the last, the particular, incremental improvement that repetition produced when the person repeating was paying attention and the person instructing was patient enough to let the repetition teach rather than interrupting it with correction. After 20 minutes, Jonah's arms were shaking. His grip was failing. His shoulders ached with the particular deep fatigue of muscles that had been asked to perform a task they had never trained for and were registering their formal complaint. "Enough," Bryn said. She took the hammer. She inspected the iron. The surface that Jonah had been striking bore the evidence of his 20 minutes. Uneven, pocked, the particular chaotic texture that a beginner's work produced when the strikes were inconsistent and the aim was approximate. "This is terrible," she said. "I know. Your hands are wrong. Your stance is wrong. Your breathing is wrong. You're hitting from the wrist instead of the shoulder, which means you have no power and no accuracy, and the iron is receiving a suggestion rather than a command." "I'm a clerk," Jonah said again, as though repetition would eventually transform the explanation into an excuse. "You said that already." She looked at him, at the shaking arms, the red face, the particular sweaty exhaustion of a man who had just discovered that his body was capable of significantly less than he had assumed. "Why did you come over?" "You invited me. I invite travelers to the inn too. They don't come back the next night." "Will I come back?" Bryn looked at him with the particular evaluative directness that she brought to everything, the same directness with which she assessed iron and identified flaws and determined whether the material was worth working. "Will you?" she asked. "The sparks are still beautiful," he said, "even the ones I can't make yet." "You can't make any yet. Then I have a lot of evenings ahead of me." The tectonic shift reached the surface. Bryn smiled, not the careful, modulated smile that humans produced when social convention required it. An orc smile, broad, unguarded, produced by a face that did not practice smiling for effect, and therefore produced it only from cause. Her tusks showed, her eyes creased. The smile changed the geometry of her face entirely, and Jonah, standing in her yard with shaking arms and a terrible piece of iron behind him, thought, "The sparks are not the most beautiful thing over this fence." But he did not say that. Some truths were better held than spoken, and this one was too new and too fragile and too important to survive the translation from feeling to language. "Tomorrow," she said, "same time, and drink your tea before you come over. Cold tea is a waste of leaves. If this story already has you, if you felt the weight of a hammer in CLERK's hands, or the word beautiful applied to something a blacksmith calls waste, drop your country in the comments. Hit join to see part 2 first. A super thanks keeps the forge burning. Part 2 is where the fence starts getting shorter, where two different crafts discover they speak the same language, and where a man who spent 10 years making nothing finally makes one thing that holds. "Trust me, you made something that holds," is the line that changes everything. He came back every evening for 3 weeks. This was the fact that Bryn did not know how to categorize and therefore could not dismiss. She had expected the curiosity to burn out, the particular temporary fascination that humans sometimes developed for orc culture, the way they developed fascinations for exotic food or foreign music, consuming it enthusiastically until the novelty expired and the regular palate reasserted itself. Jonah's curiosity did not expire. It deepened. Each evening he walked through the gate, the same 3 steps, his yard, the gate, her yard, and he stood at the forge, and he picked up the hammer, and he hit the iron, and the hitting was terrible, but the coming was consistent, and consistency was, in Bryn's professional assessment, more valuable than talent. Talent could be taught. Consistency had to be chosen. "Your wrist is still wrong," she told him on the 8th evening, watching him produce a strike that was approximately 20% better than his first day strike and approximately 80% worse than competent. "I know. You're compensating with your elbow. Stop thinking about the arm. Think about the shoulder." He adjusted. The strike improved, fractionally the particular minuscule increment that separated terrible from slightly less terrible. A spark detached. Small, brief, barely luminous. "Better?" he asked. "Worse, actually, but differently worse." "Which is progress." She said it without cruelty. The particular professional honesty of a craftsman evaluating work in progress and communicating the evaluation without euphemism, because euphemism wasted time and time at the forge, was measured in the cooling of iron. "You know what your problem is?" she asked one evening during the 3rd week. "I have several. You have one. You're treating the hammer like a pen. A pen requires precision, small movements, controlled, the tip doing the work. A hammer requires the opposite. The body does the work. The hammer is the extension. You're trying to write with a hammer, and that's like trying to forge with a pen. Jonah looked at his hand on the hammer handle, at the grip, tight, controlled, the specific hold of a man whose fingers had spent 10 years in the fine motor configuration that pen work required, and that had become the default setting for every subsequent task his hands attempted. "Let go," Bryn said. "Of the hammer, of the pen. You're holding a hammer, but your hands think they're holding a pen. Let the pen go." He tried. The loosening was difficult. The particular counterintuitive process of releasing a grip pattern that had been installed through 10 years of repetition. His fingers did not want to open. His wrist did not want to flex. His body was holding on to the last decade's muscle memory with the specific, stubborn persistence of a system that considered change a threat. He let go. Not completely. Completely would have dropped the hammer. But enough. Enough that the grip shifted from pen to something else. Something that was not yet hammer, but was no longer pen. The transitional grip. The grip of a man who was between two things and had not yet arrived at either. He struck. The sound was different. Not good, but different. The particular changed quality of a strike produced by a body that was no longer holding on to what it used to be, and was beginning tentatively to explore what it might become. "There," Bryn said, and the way she said "there," with the specific, satisfied precision of a craftsman who has watched a student cross a threshold that the student has not yet recognized, told Jonah that something had shifted, even if he could not name it yet. The town talked. This was expected. Border towns talked the way forges produced heat, continuously as a byproduct of operation rather than as a deliberate product. The clerk is at the orc woman's forge every night. Since the second week, he goes over at 7:30, comes back at 9. His hands are burned. What does she see in an orc? The gossip reached Jonah through the market, the specific ambient intelligence network that small towns operated, where information traveled through produce transactions and bread purchases, and the particular, coded conversations that occurred between people who were pretending to discuss weather while actually discussing their neighbors. "People are talking," Jonah told Bryn on a Thursday. She was sharpening a chisel, the particular rhythmic motion of stone on steel, the sound precise and continuous. "People are always talking. That's what people do when they're not making things. They make words instead. They're saying things about us." "What things?" "That I'm at your forge every night, that my hands are burned, that they don't understand what we see in each other." Bryn set the chisel down. She looked at him with the particular, direct assessment that she brought to every conversation, the assessment that evaluated content rather than packaging and responded to substance rather than implication. "Does it bother you?" "Which part?" "Any part." Jonah thought about it. The thinking was genuine, not the performative consideration that social convention demanded, but the actual, honest process of a man examining his own feelings and arriving at a conclusion. "No," he said. "The sparks are still beautiful. The gossip isn't. If I have to choose one, I choose sparks." Bryn picked the chisel up. She resumed sharpening. But the corner of her mouth, the particular specific geometry that Jonah had been tracking since the 5th evening, moved. They talked about their pasts on a cold evening in the 4th week, when the forge heat was welcome rather than tolerated, and the conversation had expanded from technique to territory. The particular, gradual widening that occurs when two people who have been sharing a task begin sharing themselves. Bryn went first. She talked the way she forged, directly with force without hesitation. About the direction. "My father was a clansmith, best in the iron mark. He taught me the forge, everything, the grip, the eye, the heat reading, the particular sense of when iron is ready and when it's not. I was better than my brothers by the time I was 16. Not boasting, measurement. My welds were tighter, my edges were cleaner, my heat control was more precise." She paused. The pause was loaded. The particular compressed silence that precedes a turn in a story that the teller has told before and does not enjoy telling. Clan tradition says women smith household items, hinges, hooks, cooking pots. Women do not forge blades. Blades are men's work. You wanted to forge blades. I didn't want to. I was forging blades. Secretly, at night after the workshop closed. My father's forge, my father's tools, my father's training used to make the thing my father's tradition said I couldn't make. What happened? The clan master saw a blade I'd made. He said it was the finest work from the iron mark in a decade. Then he found out who made it. The finest work in a decade became inappropriate and in violation of clan custom. Same blade, different assessment. The only variable was the smith's sex. So you left. I was asked to stop forging blades. I refused. The clan said I was no longer welcome in the workshop. I said the workshop was no longer worthy of my work. She looked at the forge. Her forge, built in a yard in a human town where nobody cared whether a woman forged blades as long as the blades were paid for. I came here, built this, started over. Do you miss the clan? I miss my father's anvil. It had a sweet spot, a particular point on the face where the steel sang instead of rang. I've been looking for that sweet spot on this anvil for 3 years. Haven't found it yet. Jonah looked at the anvil. At the marks on its face, thousands of strikes, 3 years of work, the particular accumulated evidence of a woman who had been driven from her craft by the people who taught it to her and had rebuilt it, alone in a yard behind a 4-foot fence. Your turn, Bryn said. Jonah's story was quieter. He told it the way he told everything, carefully with the particular, measured pacing of a man who chose words the way a clerk chose ink, deliberately, one at a time, aware that each one would stay. I was a capital clerk for 10 years, revenue office. I sat at a desk and recorded transactions. How much grain was sold, how much tax was owed, how much money moved from one column to another. I was good at it. My handwriting was the best in the office. My ledgers balanced to the copper. That sounds like a compliment. It's a diagnosis. I spent 10 years being the best at recording other people's work without ever doing any work of my own. I wrote about grain without growing it. I wrote about trade without trading. I wrote about craft without crafting. I was a perfect mirror, reflecting everything, producing nothing. He looked at his hands, the hands that had held the pen for 10 years, and were now 3 weeks into forge lessons, developing calluses in unfamiliar places and carrying burns and configurations that clerks' hands were not supposed to carry. One day I looked at my desk and realized I had been alive for 32 years and had never made anything, never built, never forged, never carved, never grown. I had recorded things. I had kept account of things other people made. But my hands had never produced a single object that existed in the world independently of the paper it was written on. So you moved here. I moved here to find quiet. I found sparks instead. He looked at Bryn. Your sparks are the first beautiful thing I've seen that I didn't have to record for someone else. They're just beautiful. No ledger entry, no transaction, just light and heat, and a woman who makes things. The forge crackled, the iron cooled on the anvil, untouched, because neither of them had been working for the last 20 minutes. They had been talking, the particular, specific, irreplaceable activity that two people perform when they have stopped being neighbors and started being something else and have not yet found the word for what the something else is. The first touch happened on the 5th week, and it was not romantic, it was mechanical. Jonah was holding the hammer wrong. Still, 5 weeks of correction and the grip was better, but the wrist angle was off, and the wrist angle determined the strike trajectory, and the strike trajectory determined whether the iron received a command or a suggestion, and the iron Bryn had taught him did not respond to suggestions. Stop, she said. She set her own hammer down. She walked behind him, the particular purposeful approach of a teacher correcting a student's form, the specific proximity that instruction required, and that social convention would have prevented if social convention had been relevant, which at a forge it was not. She placed her hands over his. Green fingers over human fingers. The grip repositioned, not by instruction, but by contact. Her hands guided his into the correct configuration, the particular, specific arrangement of fingers and palm and wrist that the hammer required and that 5 weeks of verbal correction had failed to install, because some knowledge cannot travel through words. It can only travel through touch. Her hands were warm, not forge warm, body warm. The particular elevated temperature that orc physiology produced as a baseline, the specific heat of a person whose metabolism ran hotter than a human's and whose touch carried the thermal signature of a body that was, at all times, slightly on fire. Here, she said. She adjusted his wrist, a small movement, 3 degrees of rotation. Not from here, she touched his forearm. From here, she touched his shoulder. The touch traveled up his arm like a current, the particular physical communication of a body telling another body where the movement should originate. Now strike. He struck. With her hands still on his, the hammer came down, guided by 4 hands instead of 2, green and brown, the combined grip producing a strike that was, for the first time in 5 weeks, correct. The sound was right, the ringing percussive note that Bryn's strikes produced, the specific acoustic signature of metal being commanded rather than suggested at. Sparks erupted, not 1 or 2, a shower, the particular luminous cascade that a correct strike produced, the fragments rising in the arcs that Jonah had been watching from behind the fence for 5 weeks, and was now, for the first time, producing himself. The sparks rose between their combined hands, green and brown, forge-lit, the particular, brief, beautiful waste that imperfect contact between hammer and iron produced, and that a clerk had called beautiful, and a blacksmith had never thought to call anything. Bryn's hand stayed on his for 3 seconds after the strike, 3 seconds of unnecessary contact, the particular, specific duration that separated instruction from something else, the threshold beyond which touch stopped being functional and started being chosen. She removed her hands. The removal was slow, not reluctant, but deliberate. The particular pace of a person who is aware that what they are doing has significance and is according the significance its appropriate tempo. That was correct, she said. Her voice was half a register lower than usual. The strike? Jonah asked. The strike, she confirmed. But her amber eyes, catching the forge light, were not looking at the iron. If you're still here, if you felt green hands over brown hands on a hammer, or a spark shower produced by 2 people together, then part 3 is where a man makes one thing that holds, where a fence loses its boards, and where sparks finally fall, where flowers grow. Hit, join, drop a comment. A super thanks keeps the forge burning. Trust me, you made something that holds, is the line that breaks the fence. Project content. Orc kanali metin yazma yeni kanalar. Created by you, 37 lines. Text. Content. Sana faktur bir koncepten. Vashi bata. Da adamu. Bekar baba. Bur original script versahum. Bunu orkevranin yorlaya kaksan. Ama dikkat. Bu bir kelime değiştirme yeniden kaplama. İşi değil. Kaynağın cümlelerini ork kelimeleriyle çevirmeni istemiyorum. Aynı çekirdek hikayeyi ork evreninde. Busted. The hand clamped down on her wrist like a vice. Every customer in the diner looked away. Every single one except the man in the worn flannel shirt. Let me back up 45 minutes. At midnight on a Thursday, the only people left in the Silver Moon Diner were the ones the world had forgotten about. Truck. Pasted. The hand clamped down on her wrist like a shackle. Every person in the tavern looked away, every single one except the man in the patched wool coat, sitting alone in the back corner. Let me back up an hour. At nightfall on a Thursday, the only people left in the Gray March Crossing Tavern were the pasted. Cold rain swept across the Montana fields, turning the old dirt road into black mud. Outside a lonely farmhouse, an elderly couple stood trembling, soaked to the bone, asking only to rest in the barn. No one had followed them except the fear they carried. Inside, a former Navy SEAL, lived alone, with pasted, number orc girl, number dark fantasy, number human and orc. Buy my toy Sir Orc mommy hasn't eaten in 2 days. The riders learned who took everything. 4 human riders rode into a border settlement. A 6-year-old orc girl stood at the edge of the road holding a wooden warrior toy and a cardboard sign written in "To Pasted." The garage had a name, Marsh and Son Auto, though there was no son, only a daughter, and the sign had come with the lease, and Daniel had never bothered to change it. It sat on the corner of Ellery Street and 9th, sandwiched between a dry cleaner and a Vietnamese restaurant, and it had the particular, pasted. At 18, with everything she owned in 2 bags at a dead man's tools, Wren Mercer aged out of foster care into a town with no place for her. So when the county auctioned the boarded-up Victorian at the top of the hill, empty for 12 years, the 1 kids dared each other to touch. She raised her hand and pasted Montana, 1888. The Harlan place had been empty for 6 years. Before that, it had been Bill Harlan's life. 240 acres of Montana Valley land that Harlan had worked for 20 years before the winter of 1886 finished him. The big die-up, people called it afterward, with the specific understatement. Pasted. They said no woman would ever wed the scarred blacksmith of Cedar Hollow. And for 11 long years, the town had been right. Eli Brennan was 38 years old, and half his face belonged to a fire that had taken everything else from him, too. The left side was smooth and weathered, the face of a man who had pasted. She said it on a Saturday morning while I was down on one knee on the pine boards, drill in hand, sweat already soaking through my shirt. She was leaning against the new railing, the last post I had just driven flush, holding that white ceramic mug with the little blue flowers, looking down at me with pasted. The first hard blizzard of the winter caught Susanna Dyer with 3 sticks of wood, left, a cracked stove, a roof that leaked snow, and a 6-year-old boy. And by the second night, she had burned the last of the wood and the better part of a chair, and was lying in the one bed with Toby wrapped tight. Pasted. By the 3rd night of the Whitehorn blizzard, Red Wash Basin had vanished. Wind tore across the flats at more than 60 miles an hour. The cold had fallen to 29 below. Snow buried fence posts and erased the line between earth and sky. At Coldwater Reach, 1 section of the Willow windbreak snapped loose. Pasted. Montana, 1888. The Harlan place had been empty for 6 years. Before that, it had been Bill Harlan's life. 240 acres of Montana Valley land that Harlan had worked for 20 years before the winter of 1886 finished him. The big die-up, people called it, afterward with a specific understatement. Pasted. The notice hung on the trading post wall for 3 weeks. No one answered. Then a wagon pulled up carrying a woman, 3 children, and the smell of fresh bread. And the loneliest rancher in the territory forgot every reason he had to say no. Welcome to Shadow of the West. Subscribe and ring the bell for pasted. Red Bluff didn't just ignore Hattie. Folks actively pitted her. In frontiers where women were scarce as July rain, a woman had to be deeply flawed to sit unchosen. Hattie was fat. She smelled of neat foot oil and raw wool, breaking mustangs faster than any local cowboy. Gideon didn't want porcelain D. Pasted. The cold was a physical thing on the main street of Redemption, Nevada. It sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the road and clung to the clapboard siding of the buildings with a coat of brittle frost. It was the kind of cold that made a man's breath hang in the air like a ghost of a word. He wished. Pasted. Texas, 1886. Will Harding had knocked on a lot of doors in his 28 years. He had knocked on ranch doors and farmhouse doors at hours when decent people weren't answering. He had been turned away more times than he could count and hired enough times. To keep moving, he had spent his who, pasted. The mating auction was where you went when no one wanted you. And as Claire stood among the desperate women who had been passed over or discarded, unlike the others, she didn't try to be seen. A heavy hood concealed her face completely. shadowing the truth she could never reveal. So the crowd whisper, "Past it." The transport skims across the courtyard faster than it should, and before the warning bell even finishes its first note, a hand closes around my arm and pulls me sideways out of its path. I stumble, catch my balance, and turn to see who just touched me. A young man stands there breathing hard. Sty pasted. 5 women came to his mountain. 5 women left before the week was out. The 6th one arrived, looked at the cabin, looked at him, and said, "Well, we both have work to do." She never left. Welcome to Shadow of the West. Subscribe and ring the bell for more legendary tales of love, courage, and thank. Pasted. The fierce alien queen's panic cut through the night air like a blade forged in dying stars. Her sons had vanished. 2 small, blue-skinned princes, hope of the dynasty, had disappeared without a trace from the heart of the sprawling metropolis. Guards combed every corner of the central plaza. There, pasted. The carriage came up the long dirt road to the Carter Ranch just after sunrise, wheels cutting through frost that hadn't yet burned off the grass. And Ethan Carter knew before it had even come to a full stop that his whole world was about to tilt sideways. He was 34 years old, pasted. Samuel Brennan dropped to his knees in the blood-stained snow. His hands, the same hands that had failed to save his dying daughter 3 years ago, now pressed against the pregnant woman's frozen cheek. She wasn't breathing. 3 children huddled behind the overturned wagon, watching him with hollow eye. Pasted. Rain hammered the bulletproof windshield of the Rolls-Royce Phantom as it carved through the flooded streets of Lower Manhattan at 2:47 in the morning. Alessandro Ferraro sat in the back seat, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles in his neck were corded like steel cables beneath the collar of his bee. Pasted. Do not feed her. She is not a customer. Grant Maddox said it loud enough for the whole diner to hear, and for one cold second, every fork stopped halfway to every mouth. Rain hammered the windows of Hartwell Table on the edge of Cedar Falls, Ohio, turning the parking lot lights into trembling yellow. Pasted. He didn't stop for strangers. Not anymore. But when his horse reared back on that sun-scorched trail and Ethan Cole saw her, a pregnant woman on her hands and knees in the dirt alone, her broken wagon listing sideways in the heat, something older than his grief moved through him. Something he thought. Pasted. My name is Daniel. I'm 38, a structural engineer, and a single father to a 7-year-old named Ellie. On a Thursday in early June last year, I did the dumbest thing a decent man can do, and a woman I barely knew answered with a sentence that changed the rest of my life. I just finished work and gone out. Pasted. 6 weeks of failure produced one success, and the success was ugly. Jonah had been working toward it without knowing what it was, the particular, undefined goal that existed somewhere beyond terrible and before competent, the specific point on the spectrum of craft where the person practicing crosses from producing waste to producing something. He had not crossed that point in 6 weeks of evening sessions, and he had stopped expecting to cross it, which was, paradoxically, the condition that allowed the crossing to happen. It was a Tuesday. The iron was the same iron, a rod of scrap that Bryn had designated as practice material, because it had already been worked and reworked so many times that its metallurgical integrity was compromised, and its only remaining purpose was education. Jonah had been heating it, striking it, cooling it, reheating it for 6 weeks, and the rod had absorbed his incompetence with the patient, geological endurance of a material that had been iron for considerably longer than Jonah had been a person. He was not thinking about technique. This was the relevant fact. For 6 weeks he had been thinking about technique, about the grip, the wrist, the shoulder, the particular specific biomechanics that Bryn had been teaching him with the patient. Detailed instruction of a craftsman who believed that understanding preceded ability. He had been thinking so much about technique that the thinking had become the obstacle, the particular self-defeating loop of a mind trying to control a process that required the mind to step back and let the body work. On this Tuesday, he was not thinking about technique. He was thinking about Bryn, about the way she had adjusted his grip the previous week, her hands on his, the warmth, the 3 seconds of unnecessary contact, about the forge light on her face, about the particular specific quality of her concentration when she worked, the total absorbed focus of a person doing the thing they were born to do, the focus that made everything else in the world peripheral and the iron central. He struck the iron while thinking about Bryn, and the strike was correct, not because the technique had finally clicked, because the thinking had stopped, and the body, freed from the mind's interference, had done what 6 weeks of practice had been installing. The particular, automatic, trained response that craftsmen called muscle memory. And that was actually the body's way of saying, I learned this already. Stop helping. The rod bent, not randomly, intentionally. The particular, controlled curve that occurred when the strike was delivered at the right angle, with the right force at the right temperature, to the right point on the iron. The curve was not perfect. It was uneven on one side, slightly too sharp on the other. The particular asymmetric beauty of a first success that carries the evidence of all the failures that preceded it. He struck again and again. The body was working now, the shoulder driving, the wrist guiding the hammer, connecting with the iron at the specific point that produced sparks and shape. Simultaneously, the iron bent, further, curved, became. 20 minutes later, Jonah held it up. A hook, not a sword, not a blade, not the elaborate, beautiful weapons that Bryn produced and that required years of training, and the particular, comprehensive mastery that only dedicated practice could provide. A hook, a kitchen hook, the kind that was nailed to a wall and used to hang pots or coats, or the particular domestic items that occupied the specific, unglamorous territory between tool and furniture. It was ugly. The curve was uneven. The point was slightly blunted where he had struck too hard on the final shaping. The surface was pocked with the evidence of 6 weeks of missed strikes and bad angles, and the particular, accumulated texture of a piece of metal that had been hit by a person who was learning to hit while hitting. But it was a hook. It was a thing, a physical object that existed in the world independently of any paper or ledger or transaction record. It had been iron. He had made it into something else. Not with a pen, with a hammer and a fire, and 6 weeks of being terrible, and 1 evening of letting go. Bryn took it from his hand. She examined it with the particular comprehensive assessment that she applied to all metalwork, the professional eye that identified flaws with the speed and precision of a diagnostic instrument. She saw the uneven curve, the blunted point, the surface pocking. She did not mention any of it. She walked into her house, the small house on the other side of the fence. The house that Jonah had never entered, because the forge was the shared space, and the houses were private, and the boundary between shared and private was one of the few boundaries that had not yet been crossed. She came back, holding a nail. She went to the kitchen wall, the wall that was visible through the open door, the wall that held the tools and utensils of a working household. She placed the hook against the wall. She drove the nail through the mounting hole that Jonah had, apparently without realizing it, forged into the hook's flat end. She hung a pot from it. The pot hung. The hook held. The wall accepted the weight without complaint. The particular functional test of a piece of metalwork, not is it beautiful, but does it hold, was passed. You made something that holds, Bryn said. The sentence landed in the kitchen with a weight that exceeded its components. 5 words. Subject, verb, object, modifier. The grammatical structure of a simple declarative sentence that was, somehow, the most significant thing anyone had said to Jonah in 32 years. He had made something with his hands, with the hands that had spent 10 years holding a pen and producing nothing except records of other people's production. He had made a hook. It was ugly. It was imperfect. It was the most basic functional piece of metalwork that a forge could produce, the particular minimum viable product of blacksmithing, the thing that beginners made when they were not yet capable of making anything else. And it held. It's crooked, he said. Everything is crooked at the beginning, Bryn said. Straight comes later. Holding comes first. She left the hook on the wall. She did not replace it with one of her own. She did not improve it or adjust it or perform any of the corrections that a professional blacksmith would normally apply to amateur work, hanging in her own kitchen. She left it as it was, crooked, pocked, the particular beautiful evidence of a man's first successful attempt at making something with his hands. It hung in her kitchen, his hook in her house, on the other side of the fence. And the fence, the 4-foot wooden fence that separated their yards and their houses and their lives, felt, for the first time, like something that should not be there. Bryn's secret work came out on a Thursday in the 7th week, when Jonah couldn't sleep and went to the kitchen for water and looked through his window into the yard next door. Bryn was at the forge, late, past midnight, the particular hour when even blacksmiths were usually finished. But the fire was burning, and the anvil was occupied, and the hammer was falling in a rhythm that was different from her usual rhythm. Faster, more precise, the particular elevated tempo that occurred when a smith was working on something that required their full capability rather than their standard output. She was forging a blade. Not a kitchen knife, not a tool. A blade, long curved, the particular shape that orc combat traditions had developed over centuries, and that the Ironmark clan had been famous for producing. The iron was not scrap. It was good steel, the kind that Bryn kept in a separate storage chest and that Jonah had noticed but never asked about because the chest was locked, and locked things were private. The blade was extraordinary. Even from across the fence, in the dark by firelight, Jonah could see the quality, the particular, precise curve of the edge, the evenness of the taper, the specific, consistent geometry that only a master smith could produce. This was not a practice piece. This was not a commission. This was the work that Bryn did for herself, the blades her clan had told her she could not make, forged in the dark, in her own yard, on her own anvil, with the particular, defiant persistence of a woman who had been told she was not allowed and had decided that not allowed was a description of other people's limitations rather than her own. Jonah watched, not from behind the fence this time, from his window. A different angle, a different kind of watching. Not the watching of a stranger observing a spectacle, but the watching of a person who understood what they were seeing because they had been close enough, for long enough, to know what the seeing meant. She was forging the thing she had been expelled for forging, in the dark, alone. The specific, private, necessary work of a person maintaining an identity that the world had tried to take from her. He did not go outside. He did not cross the fence. Some work was private, and the privacy was part of the work. But he watched, from his kitchen, in the dark, the way she had once been watched from behind a fence by a man who called sparks beautiful. The next evening at the forge, he asked, "The blade you were forging last night." Bryn stopped, the particular arrested motion of a person who has been observed doing something they considered private and is recalibrating their response. "You saw that," she said. "From my kitchen window. It's a personal project. It's a sword. It's a sword, the kind my clan said I couldn't make." "Can you make it?" She looked at him. The question, "can you?" was not about capability. She could make anything. The question was about permission, about authority, about the particular internal negotiations that a person conducts when they are doing something they believe is right, and that the world they came from believes is wrong. "I'm making it," she said. "Whether I can is a question for people who need permission. I stopped asking permission when I left the Ironmark." Jonah looked at the forge, at the tools, at the yard that contained a woman's entire professional identity, rebuilt from rejection, maintained through stubbornness, producing in secret the work that her tradition said she was not allowed to produce. "Can I watch?" he asked. "Not from the kitchen, from here. You want to watch me forge a blade. I want to watch you forge the thing nobody said you could. That's different from watching sparks. That's watching someone be who they are." Bryn looked at him for a long moment. The forge crackled. The evening darkened around them. "Sit," she said. "Don't talk. Watch." He sat. He watched. And she forged, not the practice pieces, not the commissions, but the blade, the real work, the particular, private, essential work of a woman being herself in front of someone who had asked to see it. The sparks that night were different, brighter, more intense, the particular elevated quality of waste heat produced by a smith working at their peak on material that demanded their best. producing something that was simultaneously forbidden and inevitable. Jonah watched every spark, and this time he did not think beautiful. He thought brave. The fence began losing boards in the 8th week. Jonah noticed on a Monday morning. The fence, the 4-foot wooden fence, 5 boards high that had separated their yards since before either of them had moved in, was 4 boards high. The bottom board was gone, not broken, not fallen, not displaced by weather. Moved. The nails were pulled. The board was absent. The gap at the bottom was approximately 8 inches. Not enough to walk through, but enough to see through from a lower angle, enough to let air and light and the particular atmospheric exchange that occurred between 2 adjacent spaces pass more freely. He did not mention it. On Thursday, another board was gone. The fence was 3 boards high, hip level. The gap at the bottom was now 16 inches, wide enough for a cat to pass through and narrow enough for a person to step over rather than walk around. He did not mention it. The following Monday, 2 boards. The fence was down to waist height. 2 boards approximately 24 inches, the particular dimension that converted a barrier into a suggestion. You could lean on it. You could rest your arms on it. You could look over it without standing on your toes. Jonah stood at his kitchen window and looked at the fence, at the boards that were there and the spaces where boards used to be, at the particular systematic reduction of a structure that had been 4 feet tall and was now 2 feet tall, and was getting shorter at a rate of approximately 1 board per 3 days. He looked at Bryn's yard, at the forge, at the back of her house where a small stack of fence boards was leaning against the wall, the removed boards not discarded, but stored. Evidence, the particular visible proof that the fence was not deteriorating. It was being disassembled, deliberately, board by the person on the other side. On the 9th week's Monday, the fence was 1 board high, shin level. Functionally absent, you could step over it without adjusting your stride. It was a line in the dirt more than a fence, a memory of a boundary rather than a boundary itself. "Your fence is shrinking," Jonah said that evening at the forge. Bryn was working, the blade again, the nighttime work that had become evening work since Jonah had asked to watch. The particular private practice that was no longer private because he was there, and the being there had been requested, and the requesting had changed the nature of the privacy. "Wind," Bryn said. "Wind doesn't remove nails. Border wind does." "Bryn, yes, you're taking the fence down." She struck the blade. The sparks rose, bright, parabolic. The particular beautiful waist that Jonah had been watching for 9 weeks, and that still made his chest do the specific, involuntary thing that beauty produces in the bodies of people who are paying attention. "The fence was 4 feet, she said without looking up from the anvil. 4 feet is for strangers. We are not strangers. What are we? We are 2 people who share a forge and a hammer and a yard and a set of evenings." She struck again. 4 feet is too much fence for that. How much fence is right? She looked up from the anvil. Amber eyes, forge lit, carrying the particular, direct, unblinking honesty that she brought to everything, and that was, Jonah had learned, not aggression, but clarity. The specific, unpadded communication of a person who considered euphemism a waste of good air. "0, she said. 0 fence is right." The last board came down on a Sunday morning in autumn when the leaves were turning and the forge smoke smelled like wood smoke, and the particular, golden quality of border town October was making everything look like a painting that someone had made with 2 warm colors. Jonah came outside. The fence was gone, not reduced, not lowered, gone. The last board had been removed. The nails were pulled. The post remained. 2 wooden posts, standing like sentinels at the edges of a border that no longer existed, marking the place where a separation used to be. 2 yards, 1 space. Jonah's flowers on the left, the small, careful garden he had planted in the 2nd month, the particular domestic project of a man who had discovered that growing things was another form of making. Bryn's forge on the right, the anvil, the fire pit, the tools, the particular working landscape of a woman who made things for a living and was, through the daily practice of her craft, teaching a man who had never made anything that making was the point. The 2 yards were now 1 yard, and the 1 yard contained flowers and a forge and the particular impossible, beautiful combination of things that should not have worked together and did. Bryn was at the forge. She was working. Not the blade, not a commission, a small piece. Quick work. She finished it before Jonah reached her. "Hold out your hand," she said. He held out his hand. She placed something in his palm. Small, warm from the forge, the particular residual heat of newly worked metal. A hook. A perfect hook, the same shape as the one he had made, the crooked, ugly, wonderful hook that was still hanging in her kitchen holding a pot. But this one was perfect. The curve was even. The point was sharp. The surface was smooth. The mounting hole was precise. And it was made from the same scrap rod that his hook had been made from. The same material. Different hands. "For your kitchen," she said. "So we match." His hook in her kitchen. Her hook in his. 2 hooks, 1 crooked, 1 perfect. 2 kitchens, 1 in each house, 1 yard between them, 0 fence. "We match," he said. On an evening in late October, they sat in the yard, the single yard, the space that used to be 2 yards and was now 1. The forge was cooling, but by far and down the river resting forest, weakened cows went up and down after a bed, with another one laying right bang forest, weak and grease, sad with another one forest. This was what we referred to, but the embers glowed, the particular deep orange remnant of a fire that had been burning all evening and was now settling into the specific, contented warmth of a heat source that had done its work and was resting. Jonah was beside Bryn, not across the fence. There was no fence. Not at a professional distance. There was no professional distance. Beside her, on the ground, in the yard that belonged to both of them because the fence that had divided it was gone, and neither of them had rebuilt it, and the not rebuilding was the particular, specific, architectural declaration of 2 people who had decided, through the daily practice of proximity, that separation was no longer the arrangement they preferred. "I came here for quiet," Jonah said. "You found a forge. I found sparks. Then I found the woman who made them. Then I found—" He stopped. The sentence he was building required a word that he had not yet said, and that the saying of would change things in ways that could not be unsaid. Words were permanent. He knew this. He was a clerk. His professional life was the management of permanent marks on permanent surfaces. He did not use words he was not prepared to have exist forever. "What?" Bryn asked. "I found the thing I didn't know I was missing. Not the quiet. Not the sparks. The making. The particular experience of hitting metal and watching it become something. And the particular experience of watching someone else hit metal and understanding that the hitting is who they are." He looked at her, at the green skin and the amber eyes and the forge-lit angles of a face he had been watching for 9 weeks, and that he could now describe in more detail than his own, because his own face was something he saw in mirrors, and mirrors showed surfaces. Bryn's face he had watched while she worked, which meant he had watched it while it was being itself, and being itself was deeper than any surface. "The first night I told you the sparks were beautiful," he said. "They were. But they're not why I came back." "Why did you come back?" "Because the sparks were made by someone who was told she couldn't make blades, and made them anyway. Because the sparks came from a woman who built a forge in a yard, and lit a fire, and hit metal every evening because the hitting was who she was, and nobody, not her clan, not her tradition, not the particular stupid, wasteful prohibition against women forging blades, was going to take it from her." He looked at the embers, at the fading glow, at the particular specific quality of light that a dying forge produced, warmer than sunlight, more intimate than candlelight, the light of a heat source that was not decorative but functional, that existed because someone had built it and maintained it and used it to make things. "You are the most beautiful thing I have ever seen," he said. "Not because of how you look, because of what you do, because of the sparks and the blade and the hammer and the particular stubborn, magnificent refusal to stop being who you are. Bryn looked at him. The forge light was in her eyes, amber and orange, the double warmth of biology and fire. Her expression was not the careful, guarded, professional face she had worn at the beginning. It was open. The particular, rare, undefended expression of an orc woman who had been told she was too much for her tradition and not enough for anyone else, and was being told, by a man with clerk's hands and a crooked hook in her kitchen, that she was exactly what he had been looking for without knowing he was looking. "You have terrible technique," she said. "I know. Your hooks are crooked. I know. And you called sparks beautiful, which is the most ridiculous thing anyone has ever said about waste heat. I know. Come here." He went, the distance between them, the 3 feet that remained when the fence was gone, and the forge was between them and the particular last boundary of air that separated. 2 people who had been getting closer for 9 weeks. Closed. She kissed him, or he kissed her. The distinction was irrelevant, because the movement was simultaneous. The particular, mutual convergence of 2 people who had been approaching each other from opposite sides of a fence for 9 weeks and had arrived at the same point at the same time. Green lips, human lips, the warmth of orc body temperature, the warmth of forge proximity, the warmth of a moment that had been building since the first evening when a clerk had looked over a fence and seen sparks rising into the dark and had thought, beautiful. The forge burned the next morning and the morning after, and every morning after that. Jonah's flowers grew beside it, the particular unlikely coexistence of a garden and a forge, plants and metal, the soft work and the hard work, growing side by side in a yard that had no fence, because the fence had been disassembled by a woman who had decided board by board, week by week, that the man on the other side was worth the removal. Sparks fell on the flowers sometimes, small, bright, brief, the particular transient fragments of forge work that traveled on the air and landed in the garden and extinguished without damage, because sparks were temporary and flowers were not, and the temporary cannot harm the permanent any more than a moment can harm a memory. "Your sparks are in my flowers," Jonah said one morning, watching a bright fragment land on a marigold and disappear. "Sparks don't burn flowers," Bryn said. "Sparks die. Flowers stay. Like hooks. Like hooks. Crooked or straight, hooks hold. That's what they do. 2 houses, 1 yard, 2 hooks, 1 in each kitchen, 1 crooked, 1 perfect, both holding. A forge that produced sparks, and a garden that received them, and a fence that was a memory marked by 2 posts that neither of them had removed because the posts were not barriers. They were markers. They said, this is where the boundary used to be. This is where 2 people lived on opposite sides. This is where the boards were removed, one at a time, by a woman who forged blades in the dark, and a man who called waste heat beautiful. Some love stories begin with a grand gesture. This one began with a spark over a fence, and a man who should have looked away and didn't. The sparks are still rising. The fence is still gone, and a crooked hook is hanging in a kitchen, holding a pot, holding everything. If this story stayed with you, if you felt sparks rising over a 4-foot fence, or a crooked hook holding a pot it shouldn't be able to hold, or a fence losing boards one at a time because the woman on the other side was done with boundaries, share it today. Subscribe to Orc Tears and hit the bell for more stories where sparks are beautiful, where fences come down board by board, and where a clerk's first handmade hook holds more than a pot. Tell us in the comments which moment, the sparks. If you want to see, just come over. The terrible first strike, green hands on brown hands. You made something that holds. The boards disappearing. 0 fence is right. The crooked hook. We read every single one. Thank you for being here. The gate is open. I'll see you in the next one.